So today I thought I'd talk a little around the topic of restlessness. It's a topic which is at the core of our experience as human beings. And it's explained by different teachers in lots of different ways. But you might be familiar with the analogy which is used quite frequently in yoga to our consciousness being like a lake. And that lake, which is otherwise serene in its usual state, is serene, and it reflects in it whatever is surrounding it. So the views of the forest and the mountains and the sky reflect unfragmented within the surface of the serene lake. And this analogy is used to talk about the relationship of mind and consciousness. And I think it's useful because when we talk about restlessness, well, what is it? What does it mean to experience restlessness? And of course, we have an understanding of this from how we live our lives and from the goings on of life. We know that there's times when we're being pulled at, dragged at, where we allow ourselves to become involved in things. And so there's this tension that takes place. And we talk about this a great deal within yoga circles, but indeed in many other traditions. The fundamental problem is the same: restlessness. But the word can be referred to in different ways. So this analogy of the lake is a way for us to reflect on what restlessness is objectively. The analogy, the metaphor of the lake helps to create an image in our mental field. So we conjure up this image of a lake and we see its crystal clear surface reflecting all that it does in this peaceful manner. And we have that image in our minds. And then from that, we're able to reflect on the human experience in terms of consciousness. Our consciousness is going to reflect without interruption in a peaceful manner. So without interruption, that's kind of at the core of restlessness. Our consciousness, otherwise serene, is interrupted. It becomes fragmented. And what's causing this to happen? What's causing what should be an otherwise neutral reflection of reality through consciousness is being disrupted and fragmented in a way as in a way which causes a disturbance, fundamentally because of its relationship to the ego, our sense of I. The ego processes what's reflected in consciousness in a way which has preference. So what's being reflected is no longer neutral. Now it's being quantified and measured in accord with the credentials or criteria of the ego, so that it can work to serve in resubstantiating, reconstituting, supporting the fabrication, the imaginary sense of self the the I. So this sense of self is essential to our being able to engage in the world from our individual perspective. Otherwise, consciousness, as we just said, is reflecting reality in a neutral manner. There's very little of the person in that. Another metaphor which I've heard being used is that of a film in a camera. So consciousness can be compared to a camera which takes a picture. But unless there's a film inside that camera, then nothing is stored away. It's the picture is taken, there's no memory of it, no trace of it. So the ego is what allows for that impression to take hold. It's the film in the camera of our consciousness. And so it has a role, and its role is helping us to be able to navigate this world as we know it to be, as socialized, language-based human beings. But it's the manner in which the ego functions and the manner in which we allow it to function that can cause a greater amount or a lesser amount of disruption to reality as it's been reflected through consciousness. So we'll go back to our analogy of the lake. The image is useful because we can see how the surface of the water can become fragmented, how it can become disrupted in some way or another. So we can think of perhaps a wind which is circulating around the valley where the lake is situated, or a wind which is being blown across the waters and it causes this ripple effect on the surface of the water. So now the sky and the mountains and the forest around it are no longer being reflected in the same way. You have wind, but it could be the case of there being an animal in the water, that a fish that jumps around and creates this other rippling effect. Could be rain. And it could also be something more gross, like a boat, which is traveling across the water, creating an awful lot of turbulence, an awful lot of disruption, upsetting the whole otherwise serene nature of the water. And so our consciousness is much like that. It's reflecting what's going on, but because of the way the ego allows different things which are occurring, which in our environment, to penetrate, to move inwards, it can cause a greater or lesser disruption on the surface of our consciousness, fragmenting it in a greater or lesser degree. Now, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for us in terms of our day-to-day experience, in terms of what we're doing in our meditation practice? Our whole objective is to experience a state where this consciousness is not being fragmented, not being interrupted. And so what we're endeavoring to do is to purify the ego in such a way that it isn't determining what's being let in, what's being um, allowed to affect the conscious state. And so we've talked about this in previous talks, that in our meditation practice, we are discerning what's going on. We're discerning what is taking place to either facilitate its expression, allowing it to occur, or to disregard it. And in our meditation practice, the objective is fundamentally to not allow anything to penetrate, not allow anything to move through that filtration process, which is not just awareness. So all we want to process is awareness. It's all we want to process. And in that way, awareness will not interrupt consciousness. Awareness will just allow consciousness to be and allow it to reflect. It's all the other stuff that gets through which will cause some kind of rippling effect. Now, our meditation practice is obviously of concern to us, but this is something which is going on all the time. And in our meditation practice, we have an opportunity to experience it at a very intensified, but also um, concise manner. But in our day-to-day experience, it's what's going on all the time. There's this rippling effect going on all the time. There's winds and rains and boats and fish moving all the time. And so this has been reflected through consciousness. But our ego is filtering it for us. And our ego is made up of, if we're going to put it in quite simple way of saying, we'd say it's made up of our preferences, what we want and what we don't want, what we like and what we don't like. And so it's distorting in a way where we will hold on to certain experiences and cling to them so that consciousness is no longer reflecting, but now it's being disrupted in a way where our experiences of what's going on are not in real time. They're not just flowing. They're being distorted in relation to time, in relation to space, in relation to each of our interconnected experiences. And so in our day-to-day lives, we experience this disruption. We experience this interruption to an otherwise serene state. And the events which are going on around us, like the lake water, although it's reflecting the trees and the mountains and whatever else is around it, those things, they can move as much as they want. The consciousness, the lake, surface of the lake isn't affected by what they do. The surface of the lake will always remain serene. So our consciousness isn't affected by what's going on, but it can be fragmented because of what the ego allows to move through the filtration system. And the ego will allow through anything which helps to give it a greater sense of being what it is, a greater sense of being I, being me. This is what I'm about. This is what's important. So we experience then this as a restlessness, this disruption that takes place in consciousness, this interruption to the otherwise serene state of consciousness we experience as restlessness. And in yoga texts, it's referred to in different ways, again, by different teachers using different terminology. But in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, the word that's used is vritti, which is often translated to mean movements. And in other contexts, it might be referred to as thought waves. So we can see straight away that the one word which Patanjali used in his text, vritti, we are endeavoring to explain it with many words, many terms. And I think there's a beauty in the fact that vritti is a foreign word to most of us. It doesn't have all the um, kind of limited significance. When we talk about movements, that's quite abstract too. What are we actually talking about there? When we talk about thought waves, straight away we have related it to the mind. And I think this is where we can do some more reflecting. Because, of course, in our meditation practice, when we move our attention inward successfully, we are closing ourselves off to the world around us. We're closing down our willingness to engage in what's going on at an external level. And we're doing this progressively so that we are left with the most fundamental aspect of our created sense of self, which is the mind. We're left with that. So movements at that level can be discussed as thoughts, thought waves. But that doesn't deny the fact that there are movements taking place at every level of our being, in every aspect of our being. There are movements taking place, not just at a mental level, but at an emotional or energetic level, and also at a physical level. There's movements taking place within the whole mechanism which is operating to facilitate the processing of consciousness. So we can look at our meditation practice and we can consider movements as thought waves in relation to that practice. But as you'll know, when you sit to meditate, the whole process of internalization, pratyahara, that whole process that's taking place is one of you trying to move from identification with more gross levels of manifestation, let's say the physical, external, and then in the immediate body, and you're trying to move it gradually, progressively inward, depending on the day, depending on what's been going on for you, depending on your level of experience. You can experience restlessness at a physical level, where you can't sit still, where you're prone to being distracted by what's going on around you, where you're just inclined to open your eyes every now and then. So this is a type of restlessness. But thought wave doesn't really communicate this experience. Vritti embodies this experience. But thought wave is when we're talking about what's going on in the minds. Now we can make the connection that what's going on in the mind is leading to this restlessness at a physical level. We can do that. But I think we have to appreciate that the way we break down our experience of what's going on using these models of you've got the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the intellectual, we can use these models and they're helpful for us to get an understanding. But in the real time of our day-to-day experience, it's all taking place as an interconnected web of experience. In our meditation practice, we're trying to refine that by progressively moving through each of the levels inward. But we may find when we're sitting that there's restlessness at a physical level. We're opening our eyes, we're scratching, we're looking around, these kind of things. But if we get past that, then we may experience some turbulence at an energetic level. So the energetic level is what's driving the physical, you could say. But the two are interrelated, and one is bouncing off the other. So we might not open our eyes, and we might not scratch, but we might be feeling this tension within us, or this indifference. And so we can feel this as different energies. And these are restlessness. These are causing a disruption to what's going on based on how our ego communicates them to us. how our ego responds to them. If the ego has been put out of the picture through our intellect, through our discrimination, then they won't have an effect. Consciousness will just note the experience, but not be disrupted by it. Like the lake reflecting the trees, consciousness will reflect the experience, but it won't be disrupted by it. So, in terms of the model that we're using, we can acknowledge that in our meditation practice, we're trying to, through the process of pratyahara, to internalize our attention so that we can get to that point of only being challenged by what's taking place at a mental level, at the most subtle level. And the restlessness that we can experience at a mental level, there's grades to that. But again, in the same way as the lake water reflects the trees and reflects the sky, our consciousness can reflect these thought patterns without being affected by them. The only reason it'll be affected by them is if the ego decides to make something of them, turn them into something. And then once it turns it into something, then that restlessness, which has been reflected, becomes a disruption. It becomes something which fragments what's otherwise a serene, conscious experience. So the reason I wanted to talk about this today is because I think there's a challenge for us in terms of our formal practice and our informal practice, where in our formal practice, we have lofty ambitions. We have a goal, which is to experience a state which is free of movements. When we take the definition of yoga, we're trying to experience yoga through the neutralizing of all vritti. We're trying to experience yoga by the removing of the effect of anything which is taking place. Now, what we can reflect on here is, does that mean that nothing is taking place? Or can things still be taking place, but the effect, the potency, the capacity to disrupt and fragment has been neutralized and removed? And so as a consequence, we're able to experience yoga. And this is what I'm kind of inviting us to reflect on, because it's very easy for us to think about yoga means stopping thoughts. But we're so much more than just thoughts. And there's so much more going on than just thoughts. And we can, again, appreciate that the mental level of our experience is influencing a great deal what's going on at the other levels. But it also works vice versa. What's going on at a physical level influences what's going on at a mental level. So stopping thoughts, if that's our objective, we can end up leading ourselves down a path where we become very frustrated. It's not to say that thoughts can't be stopped, that won't happen, that isn't an eventual experience. It's an eventual experience that can be facilitated. But in the process of its being facilitated, we have to acknowledge that movement is the very nature of things. But the very nature of consciousness is to reflect the movement, not to be fragmented by it. So what we're trying to do is not allow the ego to become the gatekeeper, which is going to allow all these movements to access consciousness and perturb it and disrupt it and cause all the misunderstanding and ignorance. How do we do that? We do that by remaining aware, by observing, by seeing it for what it is as it's taking place. So in our exercising our ability to just appreciate that movements happen, that I can have sensations at a physical level. I can have the inclination to move the body. I can have these. I can have the tension in the body. I can feel the stress. I can feel the emotional response at different levels. These can take place. I can have the rising up of different thoughts. I can have the rippling effect of different thought waves in response to what's going on. These can take place. This can all take place. Where it becomes problematic is when that is considered to be the most important thing that's taking place. What's of greater importance is the capacity to notice it taking place, to recognize it as something which is taking place, something which is capable of being observed. And then in that process of being able to observe it, there's an ability not to allow it to disrupt the consciousness, not to allow it to fragment the consciousness, but instead to allow consciousness and awareness to be mutually respectful of each other, and ego to be put aside, um, only called upon when needed. So the topic of restlessness, it's not one which is, in my opinion, light. And the fact that I've brought up the definition of yoga and included that in trying to explain it just indicates the very nature and depth of complexity to it. It's very usual for people to experience restlessness sitting in traffic in your car. You wake up in the middle of the night for no known reason, and then you can't get to sleep. You're waiting in line at a bank, or you're being exposed to people having a conversation that just creates this effect. And that's what it comes down to, is the effect. It's the effect which is going to perturb consciousness. It's the effect which is going to wriggle its way in there and upset things. It's the effect. And that effect is residual within us. It has potency. And so when we talk about the ego as being the gatekeeper, the ego is intrinsically connected with this potency, this effect. It wants to allow it to give it expression, to reveal its sense of importance as an entity. It wants to use the effect. So when these moments arrive and the ego sees an opportunity for the effect to just be expressed, it'll do so, unless we're paying attention, unless we've developed the capacity to be able to recognize the effect as quickly, if not quicker, than the ego. So when that effect is rising up within us, whatever level it might be, the inclination to act, the emotion which is heating us up at certain parts of our body, if we can notice it, then we can be with it. We can allow it to just express. We can allow it to be what it needs to be. That won't interrupt consciousness. That won't fragment consciousness. Consciousness can just reflect back. But when the ego identifies it and sees it, it's like, I need to do something about that. I'm going to say this, or I'm going to say that. I'm going to do this specific thing. I'm going to behave this way. So it has a way of making itself known to the world by using these residual effects which are within us. And vritti includes, from my point of view, this residual effect. Because vritti is a very abstract term for us, especially. And when we talk about residual effect, what are we talking about? What is it that we're actually talking about? We talk about a potency which is residual within us. What is all that? And, we could spend the next hour here speculating on that. But we know that it's there as a driving force in how we engage in life. And there's times when we are driven by it, almost in a way which is unknowns to us, in a way which is outside of our cognitive capacity to process. And sometimes that's not without its negative consequences. Sometimes it's okay. What we're trying to get good at is to become aware of this potency for what it is, in whatever way it might express, in terms of the way we move our fingers when we're talking. Like all of this stuff is part of that residual effect. And a great deal of it is what's characteristic of who we are as people. And it's determining how we present ourselves to the world. And a lot of it is what gives us our charm. But there's aspects to it which is controlling our experience in a way where it may not be favorable. It may not be give to get best results. But fundamentally, what's of issue is that it's preventing us from being able to recognize that we can actually observe it, witness it, be in a space where we can see it as not what's defining us, but as something that's going on. And that's our goal. No doubt this topic will be brought up again at another point, but I think that's enough for now.